hopefully make this really quick without unpacking too much, because there's just ongoing discussion about this. So something, considering, a lot of people are taking almost like a legal contract approach to scripture in terms of whether or not God is bound to Israel forever. And then also in terms of these blessings and curses, and even if there was something to do with Christ, that God can never take back some claims that were given for the land to go to Israel and whatnot. But then looking at scripture, and does it really say that? Is that really what it says? And if it was looking at it in terms of those technicalities, then, there's a few things to consider. First, what's the main point of scripture? Because you have to remember that there were certain actions taken, right? And then the scriptures were written to tell the story. And so there's some kind of association with the land and the interactions and God and beliefs. And then they told the story in a certain order. But does it really mean that we look at the order of it in this exactness? But anyway, it functions through the story, though, so we understand the interactions developing in the story. So then we question, what interactions are developing in the story for what, though? And so this is what I was basically summarizing, in the sense of that one of the main points that seems to be throughout scripture is that God is correcting a sense of deception that developed through dominions and systems, kingdoms and whatnot, to then reclaim humanity and all the earth to be realigned to God. And that there would be mechanisms for different ones to play different roles in terms of this realignment to God. And then that's the main point, that we are realigned to God, and like the earth is realigned to God, and then we develop along our evolving through that spiritual connection. And then we learn through a better system and unit among each other through discerning these certain attributes. And that's like the main point. And so then we get the story as to how that's done and why there's obstructions to it and the difficulty of it and how God did it. And so there's a lot to say about that. But one of the portions in terms of, for me, I tend to believe that the story does carry over through the stage of the New Testament in Christ. I do have a difference of opinion in how things are interpreted as to where the way I look at Christ and whatnot also results in me not being at odds with Islam and various cultures and certain portions of contribution and whatnot. But, getting to that point is probably for another time. But my main point here is that I do tend to think that what God was doing with these certain delegations in Israel and the divide and the resolving the divide and the culmination of Babylon and the transition from the kingdoms through Jesus, and then this renewed kingdom and this new heavenly Jerusalem that's not among the world, was complete. Like the function of it was complete, and that there's not these lingering aspects for Israel and this what you would call nation to be rebuilt and temple to be reestablished and holy laws to be reestablished. I don't think we're at that stage. I think that is complete. And I don't say that in a way where it's supposed to denigrate all of the other contributions, but that there's a level of freedom that it should be connected to it. And I also think it should portray that there's more freedom through the message of Christ than we see within Christianity. So there are things to remedy there. That there's just more freedom. There's more freedom beyond the genders. There's more freedom beyond these divides. There's freedom beyond so many of these things. Even beyond what we typically think of the church. And so I know that that's not even commonplace to think about. But anyway, to rewind though, when people are looking at still imagining that we're generating these conflicts because God hadn't resolved things with the nation of Israel within world kingdoms, I think that generates continual geopolitical strategies that are unnecessary and creates issues that are unnecessary among Christians, Jews, Muslims, and then the various utilizing of the regenerating conquest narrative after conquest narrative, applying claims of Amalek, which is a genocidal claim, improperly, and then that just continues. I think this is inaccurate. And so there are all these different approaches where different Christians believe certain variations, and they look at the text and they don't resolve it, and then Jewish factions and sects and groups, and then other Jewish groups disagree with them, and then there's Islam that has the different interpretations as well. But I do think there's a level of cohesiveness. But the question that I was going to look into now was the claim of the stage of the law, or the stage of the promise or the covenant of Abraham. And so what it seems that people are doing is they're looking at the promises of God as kind of like bringing God into a court of law, that God still has these claims, these eternal claims, he can't break his promise, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then other groups will say, well, it's not really written like that. There's certain agreements that are expected to be abided by in order to keep the claims. And then so it's continually argued. But what you find, what it seems like, and I'm not going to look at the references now, I'm just going to kind of talk through it, is that initially at the time of Abraham, when he was given the promise to move out of, or to leave Ur and then develop in Canaan, and to be a foreigner in the land, and then connect to there, and then God would give him the land and whatnot. At that stage, when people make reference to these blessings and whatnot that were said by God to Abraham, like to have faith in this journey, and that God would give him this land and bless him, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him and his descendants and whatnot. And so at that stage, it doesn't even talk about Israel. Israel isn't even established yet. And Jacob isn't even born yet until generations later. And so at that point, it's just them. And he doesn't even have a son yet or offspring. And so then he starts questioning, how is this going to happen? I don't even have, like offspring. And then there ends up being this stage where then he does have offspring. And there's these this son that was born from this woman, their maidservant, and then another son that was born from his wife. And then it becomes known to him that the promise will then go through Isaac. And so even at this stage, this is where people argue, and they say, so they argue this point because they still have these connections where they want to connect Israel with Isaac and Jacob, and just, or they want to connect the modern day Israel with the claim of the promise of God to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to Israel, and not the other son, because they connect the other side of the sons to Ishmael, and the other side of these belief systems, right? Eventually. But what you find there, though, the arguing point that they tend to have is that there's like this caveat, right? That they try to say, there's a caveat though, because later God says, no, the promise will go through your other son. So almost as though there's a corrective measure, that there becomes a corrective measure to the initial claim. And so they say, but later the elaboration portrays directing where that promise goes. But here's the thing. If they try to say that they are utilizing an elaboration to direct where the promise goes, then they're not 100% just looking at the technicality of the first promise, right? They're trying to claim things from the first promise in this like official perfect comparison as like a magical potion that has to be exact under the court of law. And so they look at the first promise and say, it's everlasting, It's God's promise and nobody can budge on it, on God, word on God. And it's like, well, if you're going off of the first one, then the first section, and you're saying 100%, no elaborating, on God, then it doesn't shift to Isaac. It's the first initial one. To him, to Abraham, to his descendants, unto the earth, to be a blessing, right? And there's no Israel, and there's no Isaac, there's no Ishmael. It's just him. That's it. Everlasting, right there, everlasting. And so then if you want to say no, because later he intended to say, or what it meant in accordance within it, is that it would go through Isaac. And it's like, okay, well then if you're becoming more flexible in elaborating that it shifts from the initial stage and shifts to Isaac, and then from there shifts to Jacob, and then from there shifts to Israel, then you have to go the whole thing then. Then you have to say that's the context of the whole thing. The whole thing is intended to be interpreted through the whole revelation of God, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then through Israel. And then if you're saying that the call of Abraham and the claim of everlasting and the land claims can only go through the fullness of the elaboration through Israel, seems like you're also then saying that it's required, if that's how it's intended, then it's fully intended, then it's required to then be obtained through the mandates of Israel and through the mandates of the laws of Moses. And if that's so, then you have to also accept all of the other aspects that go along with it. Like in Deuteronomy, that if you have this land, once you have this land, to keep it, so this is another caveat, and this is another directing how to obtain the land, elaborating on it. Then it talks about if you want to keep it for long, then here's these blessings and here's these curses, and then you engage in them. And then they do. And then they proclaim them, the blessings and the curses on the land. So at this point, if you say, well, no matter what they do, though, God promised it to them everlasting. But he promised it to them everlasting without a direction unto Isaac or Ishmael. It was to his descendants. That's when it was everlasting. To Abraham's descendants. And that would include various ones in the region that they had connections with, that they now have different divides against, right? So it was intended to be written as stages of explaining how God intended them to live on the land and to preserve the land unto God, unto the attributes of God. And then even if you take it from that sense and say, God from a different kingdom laying claim to another kingdom is then seeming to have to be fulfilled through whatever the legal apparatus or intention or standard is from that kingdom. And so then if he's laying claim to gifting some kingdom or retrieving some kingdom or somehow or another eventually abiding within a certain kingdom transference, he's either talking about a kingdom transference of which then the standard would then be accompanied in that claim. So then we would have to see, how does God do such things? What are the associations of God? From what dominion is God making this claim? And so what are the other associations? And also then the question would be, or he lays claim to it within the present kingdom. And then you have to ask, what are the caveats in terms of what are the standards by which that claim is made known within that kingdom then? And so then with the kingdom presently there, were there certain requirements? And is this why Abraham also assumed that there would be certain sacrifices and whatnot that he would have to make Was he in that consciousness? Was he interpreting having the land within that consciousness? Was there then an expected transforming as to how he would even perceive having that land? But anyway, the main point is that what you get to is there isn't an exacting on the land in terms of a one-sided claim of God forever that flows through the stage of Israel. It's only at the stage of Abraham, prior to the sons and whatnot. I mean, that's what it seems like. And then also, if you follow it through with the stages where they obtain the land, as I was saying, through the stage of Israel, there's certain ways that they're supposed to abide within it and maintain it. And there could have potentially been other ways by which they'd preserve it, but they didn't. And so the story reads as though they didn't abide within those things, but it still served to be revelatory. It still served to push it toward the main point of relieving this world dominion and delivering mankind and the earth unto God. There were still mechanisms to do what the main point of it even was. The main point of it wasn't just that God would come down and differentiate between groups and then build up a type of supremacy. That wasn't the main point. Why would that even be the point? Because the whole story reads about God not doing that and not wanting different ones and systems to develop in those ways. So why would he do that? And so then we find that eventually there becomes these difficulties and conflicts, but it still goes toward revealing this transformation and this shift. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to talk about that, just kind of briefly. I've talked about a lot of these topics before from a variety of different angles as they surface. And what it seems like we're ultimately finding is that the intention of God was to set in motion this redemption of the world that would be placed in the dominion of God, that would not be a temporary thing, that once restored unto the dominion of God, then it would be set in like the eternal or in the everlasting and whatnot. And that there's this sense where the conflicts and the obstructions are temporary, and they're built in that which is temporary. They're built in that which is fading or like set to fade and whatnot. And so it's just this distinction of God, or that which is boundless, God, that which is eternal. And so it just kind of reads, it seems like, in that language. And that redemptive work just isn't halted. It continues to go forward. It keeps shaping and shifting and being challenged and molded into that transformation. But I don't tend to think that there's anything that was left unresolved. I think God did abide by, at least reading the story, God did abide by that redemptive work. And then it did shift through those mechanisms into the transition of the kingdom and the freedom into this like heavenly dominion, which drew everything out from the competing world dominions. And that we just need to then reside in the spirit of that transformation. And then it's continually being revealed as accomplished and complete. And then through that, we're no longer then needing to await like a temple or needing to set up the law, because the law is there as a mediation between the conflict. And once the conflict is broken as no more generating of world dominions, and it's like delivered into this new kingdom, this freed kingdom, then we don't have the mediating law between the conflict. We have the freedom unto the reconciliation of peoples unto this spiritually liberated way of life. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to, I guess, talk about that a little bit.